Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us here as part of our afternoon sessions for the Southeast Summit. I am Sarah Sanford. I'm the Virginia and North Carolina coordinator for the East Coast Greenway Alliance. And I'm very excited to introduce Iona Thomas for our next presentation. Iona is a certified planner and the public sector director at MacAdams, which is one of our sponsors for the summit. Iona is very involved with the East Coast Greenway Alliance as both the vice chair of our board of trustees and as the very long-term chair of our North Carolina committee. Iona has experience designing trails throughout the Southeast, and we're so glad she was able to bring her expertise to one of our live presentations today. So Iona's presentation is The Missing Link: How a Modest Investment in Planning Can Get More Trail on the Ground. And having worked with Iona on projects like this, I can vouch that this presentation will be incredibly helpful for any trail planners, RPO, MPO staff, and other professionals who are trying to get trails built, especially in rural areas. So with that, I will hand it over to Iona.
Thank you, Sarah. Oops, I'm going too fast. So I have to confess that I changed the name of this presentation. So it's now called Sticker Shock, A Tale of Two Trails, but it's still all about feasibility and how we can get better projects into the funding stream and then have better results when it comes time to designing and constructing these trails. So a little bit about kind of who I am and the context that I'm coming at this from. I work for a multidisciplinary design firm, and as such, we have all of the services in-house that we need to do projects like this. My personal expertise is all around greenways, and I've been working with greenways and designed and managed some of the largest greenways here in North Carolina. One of those is the Neuse River Trail project, which was 34 miles of greenway trail that was designed, permitted, and constructed all within 3 years, and that was during the recession. So there was stimulus money involved in that. 8 big bridges over the Neuse River, including North Carolina's first suspension bridges for trails of this kind. So a lot of lessons learned through the actual practice of scoping, designing, permitting, constructing, and then seeing the operation and the maintenance of a trail on the ground. So the full life cycle of a trail project. So this is kind of a look back. I mentioned that the Neuse River Trail project was built during the recession. And so you see this first data point here is 2009, where we were building trail and the cost per mile was a little over $500,000 a mile. And prices bounced around under and over that, depending on what was in the project, whether it had a lot of bridges, a lot of boardwalks. But we were still bouncing around that number of under between $750,000 and $1 million per mile. Had historically been a safe guess for what a mile of trail would cost you. And then in late 2014, spring, I remember it very well because I had projects bidding, we saw this huge increase in the construction costs when it came time to actually get bids back in on projects. And what had happened was we had recovered from the recession, but we were still using the unit cost from bid tabs from projects that were bid during the recession. So we had really, really bad cost estimates, and our projects were coming in when it came time to bid them a whole lot higher. And so we've seen kind of a 36% annual growth as the construction market gets tighter and tighter and tighter, with the housing boom that's going on, with the commercial boom that's going on. Contractors have had their choice of projects that they want to work on, and we've seen that in these prices. How our current crisis is going to affect that, we're just going to have to wait and see. It's a little too early to tell. But as of 2 or 3 weeks ago, this was the state of affairs, where it had become very difficult to use a rough per mile cost for estimating the trails. So I want to talk a little bit about where we talk about a lot of different kinds of trail planning. And I want to be specific about the type of planning that I'm talking about today. So at the top level here, where we have regional plans, so these are large regional networks like the Circuit or Carolina Thread Trail, where a regional entity is providing leadership. East Coast Greenway actually provides this in a lot of states. It does here in North Carolina. And you see the arrow goes both ways between regional and municipal. Sometimes a municipal plan, whether it's a county or a city or a town plan, feeds up into a larger regional plan and informs that plan. And then sometimes the regional plan is looking down and getting the guidance that they need from the municipality. But the regional plan is providing that overall kind of interstate system of trails. So that's an iterative back and forth process there. Beyond the municipal planning, this is what we want to talk about today. And this step is often left out of the trail planning process. And it's one of the reasons that we've, in the bike ped world, have in some cases gotten a bad rap for not being able to expend federal dollars once they've been allocated, because we'll take a line on a map from a municipal plan, pursue funding based on some linear cost for a per mile of trail, say it's $1.5 million or $1 million or $2 million. And then we go and we pursue funding for our project, and it turns out that we haven't scoped the project correctly, either from a schedule or a cost point of view. So today we're going to talk about corridor. They're also called feasibility studies, but it really comes down to properly scoping your projects even before you seek funding for that project. And then of course you move from that point, then it's time to design your project, build it, and then ultimately we're in a scenario where we're maintaining and operating and programming that trail for your community. So this is the kind of traditional paradigm for scoping. We have on one axis here time, and on the bottom axis money. We're spending a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of money and time on scoping. So sometimes this is someone sitting at a desk, taking a linear, looking at a map, and literally taking, well, we have this many miles, let's find a multiplier for that. And then we'll ask for, we'll prioritize that into our DOT process, however that works in your state, to receive federal money. And then we spend, a good amount of time, not quite so much money, on design, and then construction, we spend a whole lot of money, and usually that is a shorter set of time. But the takeaway here is that you're setting your budget for your project with the smallest amount of time and money invested. And so we're going to talk today about shifting that. So a tale of two trails. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take a mile of trail. Project A is our dream project. So it is on high and dry ground. You own all the right of way, and you have one little pocket of wetlands over there. And so this literally is our dream project. If I were in person with all of you guys, I would ask you to raise your hands if you've ever had a project like this, and I would be very surprised to see any hands. Most of our projects look like Project B. So this is a mile of trail. It goes along a DOT highway. It's in the DOT right of way. It goes across a railroad. It goes across a jurisdictional stream that is in a FEMA detailed study area, and then it goes across a significant wetland system. So we're going to take a look item by item what happens to Project A and Project B as we do a kind of pretend scoping process on it. So all of these elements we're going to talk about today. And the takeaway here is to know that unless you have asked yourself questions or walked through a process that touches each of these elements, you have not done a proper scoping for your project. The answers to those questions will affect both the construction budget and the schedule for your project. Walk your projects. It is impossible to understand a trail project from a desk. We are blessed now to have things like Google Earth, Google Street View, a lot of amazing tools, and we use all of those tools and leverage them to the max because they really help us a lot. But there is no substitute for walking your projects, for getting on the ground, and really understanding how the context, the challenges, the opportunities, and just the physicality of a place is very important. So take the time and make sure that either you or whoever you have working on your feasibility study is spending quite a bit of time on the ground on that project. So let's talk about property acquisition first. I gotta move, there we go, I can see that now. So ideally, you've got existing ownership of your project. And in that case, that's great news, and you can fly free and it's not going to impact your schedule whatsoever. So project A is entirely within existing right-of-way or easements. So there's no impact here to your base cost of $945,000 for that mile of trail. Project B, however, we do need easements. And so you have two different paths there when you need an easement. And I give this presentation a lot in North Carolina. So when you see NCDOT, just substitute that for VDOT or Florida DOT or your local DOT. But you will need to either acquire right-of-way through a right-of-way agent, or if you're a county or a municipality that has their own right-of-way agent, they're legal folks who can do that for you, you can do that in-house. Before you can get federal funding, you will have to produce a right-of-way certificate that shows that you have all of the right-of-way that you need on the project. So before you get federal funding authorization, you've got to show that you control all the property. So this is a critical step. So in project B, we've got $60,000 worth of right-of-way impacts, which is significant. But the more significant hit comes on our budget, that it takes an additional 6 months to negotiate and acquire those easements. So understanding the relationship between the Clearzone, drainage, and property relationships is very important. So if you think back to project B, we have a section that is along a road right-of-way. And this is a road here in North Carolina, NC 56. And the Clearzone is the distance that it would take a vehicle to stop safely or to be stopped if it left the edge of pavement. And so a facility would need to be outside of the Clearzone in order to not have some kind of vertical separation, either guardrail, curb, or some other type of vertical separation that would keep that vehicle from leaving the road. And the way we calculate the Clearzone is by taking the 35 miles per hour, the average daily vehicle trips of 9,800, and then that gives us a Clearzone of 14 to 16 feet. Most DOTs and FHWA certainly has a Clearzone chart that you can refer to. So the red line here is your right-of-way. So I've seen so many municipalities think, oh my gosh, look at all the right-of-way that we have here. It's awesome, we can get a trailing. Well, when you calculate the Clearzone, that is your yellow line there. So 14 to 16 feet. I think we did this at 15 feet, just a split difference from edge of pave. So that means that you're now in people's front yards. And so you have a choice to make. Do you acquire all the right-of-way that you would need to have a facility that is outside of the clear zone? So this green line here would give you a 10-foot path with 12-foot shoulders. So that's our typical multi-use path. So you can see now we're really in people's, not just front yards, but front doors. So many times this is not an acceptable route to go. It leaves us acquiring many, many properties. And so then that turns us to going with a curb and gutter solution. So this is what you see here on the left-hand side of your screen. This trail, we've installed a gutter, which serves that vertical separation between the vehicles and the cars. But we've also had to include enclosed drainage system. So now this is, we've got pipe under here, and so all the stormwater is being routed through inlets and pipes, and there's a cost that comes with that. So when we're trying to negotiate this clear zone drainage relationship, we can look for a different alignment, and that's actually what we did on this NC56 project. We ended up going along the lake with some boardwalk, or you can acquire right-of-way. This has a potential cost impact, but a real schedule impact that can hold you up. Or you can go with curb and gutter, which doesn't impact your schedule quite as much, but it does have a big hit on your budget. So for just this 1 mile, we're adding $400,000 to the construction budget, and it keeps our schedule the same, but it adds quite a bit of change to the construction estimate. So FEMA compliance, a lot of the greenways and trails that happen across the Southeast happen in FEMA studied streams. So floodplains are areas where you're not able to develop the land for any other use. So often we find ourselves relegated to this zone for the design and construction of trails. So this is a very common scenario. So this is when you look at the FEMA maps, and each state has a different interface for this. You'll see what you see here, the hatched mark is a detailed study area. And that means that any modifications that we make to the grade, any fill that we put in this area, any boardwalks or bridges over this creek, we would have to model that and prove to the local floodplain administrator that we don't have a rise in the base flood elevation. And so what that means is when you go buy a house and you have to check the flood maps, those flood maps have to be maintained to make sure that people understand if they need to buy flood insurance or not. And so any modifications that we make that change how water behaves, we have to make sure that FEMA knows how to change those maps, and then FEMA has to grant that those changes do not create an impact on insurable structure. So that's what this FEMA compliance is all about. As a whole, I'm not going to go into all of this information. It's important to know that there are really two paths. So a no-rise, your consultant would do an analysis and say that you can achieve a no-rise, which means that it can be handled at the local floodplain administrator level. If you're creating an increase or a decrease in base flood elevation of greater than 100 of a foot, then you would need to handle that at the federal level, and that is a CLOMAR or a conditional letter of map revision. In your feasibility study, you're not going to get to this level of analysis, but you do need to make sure that you have looked to see if you're in a FEMA studied stream, so that in your design estimate, your design budget, you include the consultant that you're working with doing this kind of analysis and permitting with FEMA. So again, here is our path. So on our project A, we're in a non-regulated area, so no requirements there. In option B, we can either come up with an option that gives us a no rise or a CLOMAR and then a final letter of map revision. In this scenario, we couldn't get the no rise, so we're going to have to go to the CLOMAR. And so we're adding $70,000 to the design budget. This does impact our schedule, but it's going to run concurrent with the right-of-way acquisition. So we're still at 6 months. If you hadn't already stretched out your schedule by 6 months, you would be adding an additional at least 6 months to your project to get this CLOMAR approved. Jurisdictional features, so waters of the US. These are streams and wetlands. And again, this is a very common conflict that we have to deal with on our project. It's also an asset on our project. Being brought close to these wetland features exposes our trail users to all kinds of different habitats and wildlife and educational opportunities. But there's some challenges for getting across that we need to understand when we're scoping a project. So the waters of the laws around the waters of the US say that if there is a loss of waters of the US, so if you were to fill this wetland system or to pipe a stream, that is considered a loss of waters of the US. And when you do that, you have two choices. You can pay compensatory mitigation, and this is just a quick look at what some of the costs are here in North Carolina, but it can be pretty expensive, and the ratio is usually 2 to 1, and this is administered by the Army Corps of Engineers. Or you can cross these features with bridges and boardwalks. And most often, this is the route that we go. Bridges and boardwalks totally get us around us. The permitting challenges, they do bring cost to the project at both the construction cost and the maintenance cost. But this is the most common scenario that we use to solve these challenges. So again, when we encounter streams and wetlands, we can try to find a different alignment. You can pay mitigation and fill these features, which is an unpalatable path from a cost and environmental point of view, or you can use bridges and boardwalks. So both Project A and Project B have some boardwalk. Project B also has a bridge. And so we're adding $400,000 worth of bridges to Project A, but we're adding $750,000 to Project B. So Project B is now up to $2.2 million, and Project A is still $1.3 million. NEPA, this is a schedule issue. So when you use federal money, you need to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act. Most of our projects are handled at the programmatic CE level, which is for North Carolina checklist. Categorical exclusion, or a CE, is a little more detailed, costs slightly higher to complete that. And then an EA FONSI is for, this is a rare thing for our greenways, but if there was a very long or intense or project that required crossing some really sensitive areas, you might have to go into the EA FONSI realm. So for this project, both projects, we're going to do a PCE, which adds $30,000 to the design budget, and it's going to add 3 months to Project A's budget, schedule budget, but we're going to run those 3 months concurrent with the right-of-way acquisition. So Project B is going to stay at 16. Utilities. So this is another really good reason to walk your projects. Utilities are something a kind of a pay me now or pay me later situation on utilities. It is always useful to invest in understanding what utilities are on your project as early as you can. So you would want to include in your design budget a level of subsurface utility engineering, and you can work with your designer when it comes time to design the project to figure out the right level. But at this level, we're walking our project and trying to figure out if there are utilities on the project so that we can include that in the budget. So we're not necessarily designing the solution, but we're trying to figure out if this is going to be a challenge. So we go out, we walk the project. We can also look at GIS and other data sources to see if we have utilities. Project A is, again, our dream project, and there are no utilities at all. Project B, we find utilities by others. So these are usually like phone, cable, those fiber optic cable and those kinds of things that are in the right of way, and it is the utility provider's responsibility to get that out of the right of way for you. And then there's utility by owner. So that would be like your local water and sewer. And so on project B, we've got significant utilities. So we're including $100,000 on project B for utilities, and some minor utilities on project A. I think it's always safe to have something in the budget there. Railroads. So this is another place where I would ask you to raise your hands if you've had to deal with railroads, and we would hear lots of moaning and groaning and eye rolling in the audience, and all kinds of war stories of how we've tried and hopefully successfully negotiated projects with railroads. The thing to know about railroads is railroads have absolutely no incentive to work with you, and them answering the phone, is a main strategy of not answering the phone. It's one of the main strategies that they deal with people who want to encroach in their right of way. It's to their advantage to keep pedestrian, bikes, even cars. They're actively trying to close crossings as much as they possibly can. So persistence is very important. And then also knowing what the railroads are expecting. So in this case, you can see in the top right-hand corner, this bridge has chain link fence, openings no larger than 4 inches because they don't want anybody dropping anything on the train. And so there's some basic things that experienced designers can help you understand to include in your budget. It's important to also understand that railroads, if you are negotiating an encroachment with them, that you have to pay for their engineer to review your plans. So you need to include in your design budget that cost. And then when it comes time for construction, there are some specific things that you have to include for insurance, costs associated with flagmen that have to be on site during construction. So this project does have a railroad crossing, and so we've included $250,000, which would include both design and construction costs associated with that. And it's going to add another 6 months to our project. So the 6 months, it's probably more time with the railroad to actually successfully negotiate it. So you would add your whole railroad time might be 12 months, but 6 months of that is going to be concurrent with other issues on the project. Construction services, you're going to need to include construction administration and construction inspections. You've got different options here. All projects have the need for construction administration. So if you're looking at a budget and there's nothing for CA in there, that's not a complete budget. So for project A, that owner has inspectors and staff that can do most of their construction administration, but they're going to farm out the construction materials testing to a consultant. And so for that project, we've got $140,000 in there. But then project B, they're going to go full CEI, and that's 10 to 12% of construction costs, which is a little over $300,000 there. So all of these pieces feed into your scoping. And when we look at the tale of two trails, project A here ends up at $1.5 million and a 13-month design schedule. Project B is $2.9 million and 22 months in design schedule. So you can see how dangerous it would be to use a per mile cost in estimating for this project B cost. And knowing that most of our projects are much more similar to project B than project A, it is always going to pay off to spend a little bit of money on doing feasibility analysis. I'm going to wrap up here by moving really quickly through a methodology for feasibility analysis, where we use base mapping, field investigations, and then an iterative process between CAD modeling and our cost estimating. So I've talked a little bit about all of the data that is available to us. We are in a robust time of data, so all of this is light years ahead of where we started out, and it's incredibly valuable to the project. It doesn't, however, take the place of getting in the field and really looking at your projects and understanding the spatial reality of what you're dealing with and where the utilities are. And so time in the field is essential. And it's important, we feel the model that we've developed actually uses LiDAR data to create a CAD model for our conceptual alignments. And what is important about that is that's generating quantities of asphalt, quantities of earthwork, lengths of bridge, lengths of boardwalk. So we are actually much closer to the kind of estimating that we do at the end of a project when we know exactly what all those quantities are going to be. These are conceptual quantities, but it allows us to get much closer to good costs for the project. We also rely on a Greenway bid library where we are aggregating unit costs across projects that have been bid in the last 3 to 4 years. And that is really helpful because when we use DOT unit costs, the economy of scale for those large roadway projects really skews cost lower than they are for some of these smaller projects. And we can rectify that by pulling unit costs from actual bids. And then when it comes time for doing cost estimating, we take those design quantities, we use unit costs specific to greenways. We're using the tax value based on easements. The easements are generated off that model again, where we're looking at the real easements that we'll need for a project, not just kind of guessing 50 feet here, 75 feet here. And then you include the cost to design, permit, the CEI and contingency. And then it's critical that you escalate to your construction year. So if you're working with a consultant on a project and they're not asking you what year you're going to build this in, you need to make sure you have a conversation about when you're going to build it and what factor you want to escalate your base cost so that you get a cost that is escalated to the proper year. So many estimates that we have to live with for years and years and years were not escalated. They were today dollars, and that doesn't help you in 3 or 4 or 5 years when you're trying to actually construct the project. And then only once you have all of those pieces do you have a total project budget. So what I'm proposing here is that we move to a model where we're spending some money and some time on scoping or doing feasibility study, quarter studies, whatever you want to call it. I firmly believe that if we do spend time and money on scoping, that the overall time and money that it takes to design and construct these projects will actually shrink. So we have a slightly smaller inverted triangle here, and that's because we knew more about the project because we invested more in scoping. And the last thing I'll close with, this may seem kind of like a red herring, but I do want to urge you on all of your projects to collect data. You would not build an aquatic center and not count how many people come to that center. And DOTs count every road in their network every year, so we know how many people are using those roads. Your elected officials will appreciate knowing what the return on investment is for the capital dollars that go into these Greenway projects. So when we are effectively collecting data across all of our greenways, it's going to be much easier to make the case to do these feasibility studies and to spend the money on greenways, because we'll be able to articulate that return on investment with much more clarity. And so, Sarah, I think that is it for me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Iona. We do have time for a quick Q&A, so we'll do that for a few minutes before finishing up. One question I see here in the chat, Christine had asked, if your state DOT no longer publishes average unit costs, where would you find that information? And I think you had mentioned bids. And so Christine asked, where would you go to find these bids? Ideally, is it from the city or town that you're working in?
Yeah, so you would reach out to the city or the county, whoever has constructed greenways, and you can reach out across your state to get recent bid tabs. So the question you want to ask is, hey, I know such and such greenway just got built. Would you share the bid tab with me so that I can use that in doing a cost estimate on another greenway? It is important, the more bid tabs you have, the better your estimate is going to be, because you can kind of take in, like you could take out a greenway that had a ton of boardwalk and bridges if your project doesn't have that. So these projects are so small in the scale of construction projects that the unit costs really do change quite a bit based on the kind of subtleties of the project.
Great, thank you. Another question is, do you find a cost difference between rail trail projects versus other greenway projects?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, most rail trail projects are a lot less expensive than traditional projects. Like if you compare a trail that's down in a floodplain that's got lots of wetlands and you have to do stream crossings, to a rail trail project, rail trail projects, often we're lucky enough to inherit, really stable subgrade. The overall grade of the project is not going to exceed 2% because railroads don't exceed 2% in most cases. Sometimes rail trails, you're even left with some structures that you can rehabilitate. So definitely the wetter the project it is, the more expensive it's going to be. And rails, luckily are usually high and dry.
Great. So another person asked about situations in which you cannot get the easement that is critical for the project. So what happens if you are not able to acquire that land, I guess?
So there's two strategies. One is time. to wait for land to change hands. The project that I showed you early in the presentation, the Neuse River Trail, when the city of Raleigh in the 70s said that they wanted to build that project, which was an audacious thing, they only owned 5% of the land. And so it took them, 20 or 30 years to piece together the land. They made a commitment to themselves at that point that they were going to do the project. And so the condemnation was one of the tools in their toolbox that they were willing to use. So a lot of land changed hands on that project, and they also mechanized the way that the easements were collected. There was in their UDO, they included in their UDO that every time land changed hands on the Neuse, that an easement would be recorded when it got developed, not when it changed hands, but when it changed hands for development. So that mechanized the collection of the easements, but they were also always willing to use condemnation. So if a community is willing to use condemnation, that is one path. The other path is perseverance and time. And then I guess the final alternative is to find a different route.
Great. So one question that was just submitted, how are the scoping and design phases distinguished from one another?
Oh, that's a great question. So often first of all, by many, many years. So communities invest in the feasibility analysis often before their project is funded. So this is before they're programming it into their CIP or before they're trying to get it programmed into their state DOT's TIP. So it's separated by time. And so your feasibility study, the products of the feasibility study are mainly the cost estimate. It would also have some mapping to show any alternatives, any issues that need to be considered in design. Things like the CLOMAR and LOMAR, whether you need to do that, known utilities, so kind of that basic project intelligence. The municipality would then get the funding together for it, however that funding comes together, advertise for the project to be designed. And then when you select a designer, that designer is then taking that feasibility study, which is really just the launching point for a more detailed design where you're actually putting together the instructions for the contractor to build the project.
Perfect, thanks. I think we're going to do probably about 2 more questions. This is a good one that's very relevant to East Coast Greenway. How do you make the case for these trail projects in low density areas versus designating low traffic, low stress roads as Greenway stand-ins with designs like advisory bike lanes and other low cost interventions?
Well, that is a tough question because we get into the situation of, is something better than nothing? And I think that's a question that each community is going to have to wrestle with and come to an answer themselves. I think the case that is the most compelling for me is that the studies that we see on bike ped facilities that are separated from traffic, truly separated from traffic, we see a much greater increase in ridership, but we also see a big increase in the diversity of the types of riders. We see more women, more diversity in the age of people using the facility. So when people feel safe and comfortable because they are physically separated from vehicles, then the facility really increases in use to the overall community. There are lots of studies out there on that. I'm sure somebody's probably talking about that either before me or after me today. But separated facilities, really speak to that interested but concerned part of the population that want to walk and ride, but they don't feel comfortable on the same facility with cars at any speed. And so they're going to choose not to use the facility.
Yeah, that's a good point. For our last question, this is kind of a forward-looking one. It says, utility corridors seem to have become more popular in certain parts of the US as potential trail corridors, and so have e-bike commuting on cycle highways from suburbs and further out areas in Europe. Do you see these or others as future trends of how rural and suburban trails get built and justified?
I hope so. So one of the really compelling arguments that I see for trails in rural communities that are adjacent to more urban communities is what it does to a day trip, if you will. You know, in an urban community, the fringe rural community, often it would never occur to somebody to make a day trip to some of those communities. But when that day trip is in another mode, when it's on a bike, and it's something doable, and usually if there could be a brewery involved in it somewhere, then we get this phenomena of day trips to places that people would never take a day trip in a car to from their adjacent urban community. So I think that there is a strong economic and tourism case for rural trails. I do think that e-bikes have a place in this kind of ecosystem of trails. We need to work out the safety and the etiquette around those. You know, the speed differential is what is such a challenge about regular bikes and e-bikes mixing with pedestrians. So there's some safety things with it. But I have high hopes that we're going to get these long distance trails that go through rural communities, and it's actually going to be an economic boon for those rural communities.
Amen to that. I think that's a good note to end on. So thank you so much, Iona, for
Sarah, I meant to start with, and if you forgive me, but just sending out a thought and asking all of us to send a thought to people who are struggling with COVID, either to take care of people who have lost people or who are just in fear and stress over it. And I appreciate so much East Coast Greenway's role in how we're dealing with this crisis in all of the trails. But I did just want to, I had intended to start that way. So thanks for letting me end that way.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for being here. For those of you who have more questions, you can see that Iona's contact information is on this slide. You can email her or engage on Twitter. Iona is an active Twitter user, so you can go on there using our hashtag Greenway Summit. We will go back to our pre-recorded presentation, so you can head back to our landing page, greenway.org/Southeast Summit 2020. The 2:45 sessions are starting now. You can check those out. And with that, we'll wrap it up. So thank you for being here, everybody. And thank you, Iona.
Thank you, everybody.